Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special podcast episode where I have the honor to host one of the most recognizable writers when it came to our Man Without Fear. Yes, I'm talking about Daredevil. And since we are few days away from the premiere of Daredevil Born Again series, what better timing could it have been than to host the legendary comic book writer who also happens to be a journalist, a filmmaker, and a teacher of filmmaking? Please join me in welcoming Miss Ann Nocenti.
Hello. Hi, Saudi Arabia.
Thank you so much, Ann. It means a lot to have you on our podcast. Why am I saying that is because I just want to give you a glimpse of the past. In the late 80s and early 90s, we started to get comics from the US a bit more. And one of the comics that we did get was your work for Daredevil. This is from your work for the Inferno crossover event.
Yes, I remember. Yeah. It's funny. I was doing a podcast yesterday with a Italian journalist, and in Italy, Daredevil is just called Devil. They took the Daredevil part out and they just call it Devil.
Well, kudos to our Italian brothers and sisters for coming up with this kind of creativity. I know they created tremendous shock value for Matt Murdock. So, the purpose of this interview is to basically understand your journey because you have contributed greatly, not just to Daredevil, but a lot of uh, characters within the Marvel universe. And especially when we are talking about the X-Men universe. And quite a lot of those characters had an impact on us through different mediums as well. And basically, what this seeks to highlight is the fact that how on earth uh, a lady, correct me if I'm wrong, you were born and raised in Brooklyn.
No, I was born in Manhattan and raised in New Jersey, and then came back to New York in 1980. Got a job. That's when I got a job at Marvel Comics. But it's funny when I sat down here to do the interview and I look at this poster behind me.
Yeah.
I and I'm talking to, I assume, a audience in Saudi Arabia, where I know maybe you guys have your own superhero now, but this is an interesting film because I traveled in the desert on a falcon hunt with Qatari falcon hunters from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, and I believe the top guy who took us on the trip was from Saudi Arabia. And I remember thinking that the best thing to come out of the trip, because, and this relates to your question, there, a woman had never been on a falcon hunt before. I think there were a couple people who had written about falcon hunts, but this was, I think, the first time a female, my documentary partner Lucy Wendy Johnson had been invited on this trip, and because she spoke Urdu and had traveled the area and made
Right.
friends. And I remember thinking that the best thing about that trip was how at night around the fire, um, we all talked about the differences between the cultures,
Right.
including how some of the men that we traveled with, the women had separate homes and they practiced purdah and separation of the sexes. And so we had a lot of like really lively conversations, and the curiosity between cultures was wonderful and profound. And I just want to say that, like, that is maybe the most important thing we can be doing right now is to have cross talks between cultures, because we live in a time now, of course, with lots of strife and the building blocks of racism. It starts with fear
The
of
other.
the other, fear of something you don't know. So, and this film, you can watch it on Vimeo. You can go to my website, which is
And
AnnieNocenti.com, and I have it posted there. And it's a simple story of the love of falcon hunters with their falcons, as the Prophet Muhammad, I guess, had his first revelation in the desert when he was with his falcon. So, inshallah, that we will have more cross-cultural events somehow from this. But and then I heard you guys had your first Saudi Arabian superhero. Is that true?
not exactly. We had some work in progress, but it never launched because I believe you know Stan Berkowitz.
No, I don't.
Okay, Stan Berkowitz has been associated with the animation side of superheroes, particularly with the Batman the animated series, Superman the animated series,
Okay.
Justice League, and all that. So in 2017, we had our first ever Comic Con. So during that time, we came across a project called Latifa, which was a female superhero from Saudi Arabia. But till now, it didn't fly off. However, there is another entertainment setup that has recently been formed. It's a partnership between Saudi entertainment professional and a former writer of Marvel, B. Earl, and they have started this Weird Bunch
Oh, good,
Entertainment. So they are
good.
going to be they basically want to publish content in print and in digital by producing superheroes and superhero inspired publications that are deeply rooted within the culture over here. And
That's great. That's
and
great. It's funny because the discussion for Roy Schwartz's Comic Con, which is how I ended up here, was he did a thing called Cosmicon, and
yes,
the keynote panel was battling hate, and we all talked about how, we may just be comic book writers, we're not, but we should be doing everything we can to double down on stories that draw people together from different cultures.
no
And
doubt.
we talked a lot about how two Jewish kids, Jack Kirby from the Lower East Side and Joe Simon, literally created Captain America so that he could punch Hitler in the face. So, and that was a year before the United States went into that war. But you had a populace, especially a Jewish populace, that was living in a anti-Semitism at the time, which was partly why Jack Kirby ended up making comics, because the advertising companies were anti-Semitic and he couldn't get a job, which was the normal art job in the, I guess it would have been the 50s and 60s in New York.
Right.
So that we should all go back to that early event of two Jewish kids experience anti-Semitism, creating a hero to punch Hitler in the face to bring the U.S. into a war. I think that's a great clarion cry for us to start like doing what we can as lowly comic book writers to do something, good for the world.
In
So
fact, I would like to take lead from what you have said because I really wanted to give a shout out in this podcast episode to Roy Schwartz for first of all putting in a positive word to you about me. And I mean, this interview would not have been possible without his kindness. And also at the same time, the points that you are mentioning about the discussion that you had in Cosmic Con, Roy Schwartz has written tremendously on comic book history, superhero history. And what from, I mean, because of him, I learned a great deal because when most of us are growing up, we think of the superhero genre as an American construct. And thanks to historians like Roy Schwartz and others as well, what we learned that these superheroes, like Captain America, for example, draw inspiration from the heroes that are mentioned in our holy books, because the
Mhm.
shield of Captain America is inspired by the shield of David. You had Superman, because Roy happens to be one of those individuals who had the opportunity to look into the original manuscript of Jerry Siegel. And
And
the
are we allowed to say the title of his book? Are you, I don't know how censored your media is in Saudi Arabia. As you know, we're having trouble with that ourselves now in the United States. But I haven't read it yet. But he wrote a book that I don't know if I can say the title
no, no,
of.
I'll say it for you. Is
Okay,
Superman circumcised?
it's
It's one of
Superman circumcised. Yes, what a great title.
It's a great title. It gives a slight painful feeling to the males when they mention it. Is Superman circumcised?
Yes,
Uh,
of course.
Especially to the Muslim and Jewish people out there. But so shout out to Roy Schwartz, his book, and Roy. God bless you for making this interview possible, because Ann Nocenti is a very important part of the childhood, the teenage years of many superhero fans who were growing up in Saudi Arabia in the
Like
late
one
80s
of
and
the
90s.
things that going back to my Denny O'Neil was one of my mentors, and Denny and I were both kind of frustrated journalists. We really wanted to be like some great great street journalists, and it
Right.
was difficult to get into or make a living from that back then. And he encouraged me. He said, "Look, if you see something on the streets and you want to write about it, just put it into your comics." Because he had done No Hope in Crime Alley, and he had done
Yes.
his his alcoholism, Iron Man, because Denny had troubles with alcohol. And these things in society, if you have trouble with alcohol, people want to bury you and shove you into a closet. And Denny just said, let's have Iron Man. He had Iron Man, Tony Stark, have that as his one of a level of who he was, which I think was a vibe that Robert Downey Jr. brought into the movies too. And so you have to be brave, and Denny really encouraged me. So if I saw something on the streets of New York, or Johnny Romita Jr. also saw something on the streets of New York, we would put it right in the comic, which is why you have things like, there's a big battle between Daredevil and Bullet, but they crash through a peace rally as a way to say, yes, this is an action adventure story, but we are very aware that violence is not a good thing, but we are writing a superhero comic, so we have to do it. But let's crash through a peace rally as a way to say, or I think it was an anti-nuke rally or something, because that
Yes.
was in the 80s, that was the big thing was, is a bomb going to drop? I'm of the generation where when we were school kids, we had to dive under our desks because as a practice for a nuclear bomb dropping. Now, of course, even as kids, we knew that wouldn't save us or protect us at all. But we would like dive under our desk. Okay, the bomb might drop, you know.
True.
So I think that one of the great things about Daredevil, and I think one of the reasons why the TV show is so great, is because Street Hero, as a street hero, along with Luke Cage, I really also enjoyed the Luke Cage TV series. You can address the I mean, I guess one of the problems with the translation of superheroes into other media is the spandex suit.
Yes.
It's too bright, it's too silly, it's too, sort of ridiculous. And unless your point is that it's ridiculous, it's a bit hard to do. So I think that they did a beautiful job with Daredevil's suit and integrating him, making it darker and using lighting and integrating him into the street. I remember, and I absolutely adore Charlie Cox and Vince D'Onofrio, their devotion to Daredevil. And I was honored to meet them at a Comic-Con and was shocked to know, yep, they know who the writers are. They know who the writers and artists are. So it was I really enjoy that TV show. I remember one thing struck me was because comics, there's no sound, so you can't have a soundtrack. And we have these things called sound effects. And
Right.
so in a fight scene, you have all the crunch, In the TV show, those crunches of bones crunching and, it was like shocking to me. I was like, wow, super comic book sound effects are really quite different when you do it in a TV show with real sound. You know,
True. It's like, but for us, like the thing was, I don't know, maybe it's thanks to the imagination that I was blessed with. Whenever I was reading the comics, and there is a fight scene or anything, and especially I'm talking about the comics from the 80s and the 90s, the sound effects were not the proverbial pow, wham, kaboom. They were really thought out to the extent that, uh, uh, as a kid, when I was imagining the sounds, if you will, that okay, if Daredevil is punching Bullseye, the sound that I had imagined was pretty close to what I saw in the Netflix series.
well, you have to know that, back in the 80s when we were all in the bullpen and everybody was working together making comics, it was something that you would say out loud. You would go through like the sound effects and say them out loud in a room, and everyone would be like, "Yeah, it's not quite it." And then years later, when we all started making comics at home, and there's no going into the office, which is something the internet really radically changed. I will still be writing a script and I'll have to say all the sound effects out loud until I make sure that what would you call it? Onomatopoeia or one of those fancy words, of
I'm
how,
pretty ignorant about it.
you know. So it's one of the fun things. I also, after I write a script, um, sometimes it's not possible because the deadline is so fast. But if there's a few days built in, I'll try and get someone to read the script out loud with me because, and that's if for anyone out there who wants to write comics, it's a really good thing to do because speaking language is different from writing language. And so you can't be completely, you can say it out. If you say it out loud, you can find out, can an actor say this? Can this line be said out loud? Now, you can't go all the way that way because it's not going to be said out loud. So you have to find a mix of, and it isn't something I started to do until maybe 20 years ago. Back in the day, I didn't have that trick yet of always read a script out loud to see if it can be read out loud.
Basically, that skill of yours, that level of imagination was slowly nurturing out as you were writing more and more comics. Now, and I want to ask you that, let's go back in time because your career is quite unique in my humble opinion, because you're a young lady. I read somewhere, I don't know how much it is true, but your parents did not approve of you of reading comics and stuff.
I
But
think it was more that, my parents were second generation Italians. So, first generation, my grandparents were all born in Italy
right,
and they were farmers, coal miners, barkeeps, very, very working class.
right,
Came over to the United States via Ellis Island, via
right,
the, in what would have been like, I don't know, 1910, something like that. And my mother's family started a bar, had a bar, and my father's family were coal miners and farmers. So
right.
the second generation of the second generation is the generation that where your first generation parents worked really hard in order for you to go to college. So my mother and father were that was the first of their entire family line to go to college. And so I think my father was a scientist and professor, my mother of medicine, my mother was a pharmacist, and I think that we just had the classics in the house. So I don't think that they frowned on them so much as we just didn't have any. Like we had, for some reason, we had a book of Pogo,
Right.
which is one of my all-time favorites. Dick Tracy, again, wonderful comics, especially for the villains.
Exactly.
So I don't think it was that they didn't like them as much as they just, and also you're talking way, way pre-internet. So there were no comic shops in suburban New Jersey. You people in my school, no one ever talked about comics. No one had ever really heard of them, other
Really?
than the
In New Jersey.
yeah. And this is I was a '70s kid, and if there
Oh,
were comic shops, you had to know about them, have a car, go. But and my early years in the '60s, of course. So, I was took art classes and we all drew in the art class, and I don't remember anyone saying, "Hey, look at a comic for to learn how to draw." It just didn't really happen in it was more of an urban thing. If you were a kid in the street, you had the newsstands all over the place and you were more exposed to comics. And my mother worked in a pharmacy, and I think there were a couple comics like Archie comics,
yeah,
so I would read an Archie comic, but they didn't really speak to me,
true.
you know. So whereas Pogo did, I mean, I loved Pogo because Pogo is a comic where you can read it as a little kid and just think it's the shenanigans of a bunch of funny furry creatures in a swamp, and you can enjoy the kind of like the prose was like elevated and street at the same time. It was kind of like an interesting mix of high and low dialogue. And then as you got older you realized, oh, that goat looking character is actually Fidel Castro, and that's Nixon, and that's Spiro Agnew, and it wasn't so that you had this layering. So Pogo's still one of my favorite comics
Okay.
because of that.
And I'd like to hold you on that part. Why? Because for me, it's quite intriguing. Why it is intriguing is because I know you because of your work, especially for what you did at Marvel. And judging by, for lack of a better word, I'm using the word judging by your upbringing and the exposure that was available to you at the time, how did that take Ann Nocenti from New Jersey to Manhattan to the Marvel Bullpen that was being run by Jim Shooter, and you ended up with your first assignment, which was Bizarre Adventures, which basically was about a story about Thor, a character from Norse mythology. I mean,
Um,
how
it's
does
funny,
how did this happen?
I don't even remember that story. Um, I don't remember writing about Thor. I remember I did a very early bizarre adventure. Maybe I think it was a character about luck, really, before Longshot, and he was so greedy, that to use the luck to make money or something. I can't really remember, but I think that if you grew up in a suburb of New Jersey and you were at that point, early '70s, you're watching the Vietnam War unfold on TV. It was the first televised war. And so as a kid, I was led into protesting the war.
Right.
And my father was a professor at Columbia University, and I still have some buttons somewhere they were like scientists for peace. And I don't know if my father probably was way too busy to march, but I remember that their Columbia University back then was a pretty radical, there was a pretty radical student population, and so there were war protests. And I think that there was enough going on in my household, not comics, but politics.
Right.
So led me to be fascinated by and anxious to get into New York City. So I used to take the bus and come into the city mostly for either to march against to do I was too young in the 70s to march against the war, but later in the late 70s I would come in to go to rock shows. So there were all these rock and roll shows. And so I became fascinated with New York City. So as soon as I finished college, I went right to New York, and I was a painter.
Hmm.
Um, I have there's one of my paintings over my head there. And I came to New York with a whole portfolio of paintings and etchings. I have some etching up there that I did, and
Beautiful.
uh, brought them around New York. And like Jack Kirby. I couldn't get any work as an artist in the normal ways. I went up to advertising companies. When I think about it, it was just like Jack Kirby. They weren't hiring very many women. And I did get work as a doing paste up and mechanicals for gray advertising, and went around to art galleries. But my work was, to get into an art gallery, you'd have to have like a whole vision of the future of art, which I didn't have yet. And back then you had so again we're talking way pre-internet, and I must say that a lot of me and my friends and a lot of people that were raised pre-internet are really happy that we were raised pre-internet, because we see what's happening now with people spending 6, 8 hours a day either playing games or social media or whatever, and it's doing damage. I think it's doing damage to how you move in the world. Back then, to move in the world, you had to go out in the streets.
True.
And
True.
so I went, and, everybody got the Village Voice. The Village Voice was this great newspaper that was founded by people like Norman Mailer. And you'd look in the back for an apartment and a job. So when I got to New York, I got a room in an old tennis court that had been converted to cubicles, for people
Right.
to sleep in. And it was really cheap rent. And got it and started looking for a job. And I was a waitress, and I was doing all the things that society back then wanted young girls to do. You could be a model, you could be a waitress, you could be a hostess, and I did all those jobs. I did catalog modeling, artist modeling, I did waitressing, bartending. I did all that stuff. But the way to get into writing jobs, when I realized that I couldn't get work as an artist, I answered an ad in the back of the Village Voice that was for editorial work.
Right.
And it turned out to be what back then, now it's a bad word to call someone a secretary, but I was Jim Shooter's secretary. Now they call it, executive assistant or something.
Right.
But you were a secretary. And I remember a couple funny things happened. Was a smoker. I used to smoke like Pall Malls. And went up to the office, and Virginia Ramita, who was John Ramita Sr.'s wife,
Right.
looked at me and said, if Jim picks you for this job, I just hope you don't smoke, because back then you could smoke in the office.
Yeah.
And I lied, because I was a smoker, and I said to Virginia Ramita, I said, no, I don't smoke. And then, because I felt like, you know, how do you fix a lie? You turn it into the truth.
Yeah.
And I quit smoking. I quit smoking to get the job, because you couldn't smoke in the office. And the other thing that I did was I was not a good secretary. I was just terrible at it because I didn't want to be good at it. And Jim Shooter and I joke about that when we run into each other. It's like he'll say, "You are a terrible secretary. I couldn't wait to get rid of you." And I'm like, "Yep." You know, but he did give me, Jim was very encouraging. And then I met Denny, and Denny gave me, I think, my first job, which was the Bizarre Adventures thing, which I can't really remember what it was. And then Louise Simonson, uh, gave me and Arthur Adams a chance to create our own character, Longshot. And then Ralph Macchio, when Daredevil became open because Frank Miller, I guess, after he had killed Elektra, I don't know how long he stayed on after that, but he went on to do other stuff. And Ralph Macchio, who was the editor, gave a gave me a he was doing trial stories with established writers, and he gave me a shot to do a fill-in, and I did a fill-in with Barry Windsor Smith.
Yes.
And Ralph said, I want to give you the series. And that was pretty damn brave of Ralph, because he could have had an established writer who
True.
knew what they were doing, because you really don't know what you're doing at first. You have to hit deadlines, it's a unique form. The linguistic unit of words and pictures is fascinating, because you have to figure out how to put as much as possible into the action and pare down the dialogue, of course, and you're working in a medium where you don't have a soundtrack
Right.
to and you don't have, and I mean it's weird, but not having sound really affects storytelling. There's some kind of weird sibling between, writing and film. They're like storyboards, but you don't have the sound. And so it's an odd, and I think what happens to people once you start writing comics, you become obsessed with this, with how do you tell a great story in words and pictures when you have no sound? And every time you write a comic, you're like, this is the one, this is the one. I'm really going to get it. And then you look back and go, I blew it. But I mean, and that's why I can't talk about comics without talking about Karen Berger,
Yes.
because of Karen Berger, I got to do the Seeds in Ruby Falls with David Aja and Flavia Biondi, and I was finally able to make graphic novels where you didn't have to have at least half the story be action. And I love action, but I have a problem with violence. So when you're writing superhero comics and you're doing action scenes, you have to make sure that what is behind the fist is important. It can't, and you have to be careful of just going down that road of, a villain and a hero. It's almost meet cute. They meet, they have to fight. And it's just, you have to try really hard to have it not be gratuitous violence, but have it have really meaning to it. And it's hard to have as much meaning as Captain America's fist hitting Hitler on, the first issue of Captain America.
Definitely.
But
Right.
that is really the high bar that you're trying to reach. You're trying to have that physical action have meaning and not be contributing to the gratuitous violence of the world. So, to bring it back to Daredevil, because of the TV show coming out, that was one of the things that Johnny Romita Jr. and I would talk about all the time, which was, how can we have the action have a powerful impact conceptually and not be just gratuitous? On the other hand, I actually love comics where it's just the action is just fun.
You have
But
talked a great deal about the fact that, it's the there is the punch, and what's behind the punch is even more important. and it's not violence for the sake of violence. Forgive me for sounding a bit controversial, but you had the opportunity to work on Spider Woman comics. I believe
Oh yeah, and I killed her. Talk
yes,
about gratuitous violence.
ladies and gentlemen, you are looking at the wonderful lady who killed off Jessica Drew when she got the chance.
You know, the weird thing about that is, so Mark Grunwald, who is this beloved figure at Marvel. I mean, you probably know more about the legend than the man, but he just was like, I don't know, from archetypes you'd think of like the jester in the court, the
Right.
imp, the trickster. Mark was incapable of letting a day at Marvel go by in any kind of boring, normal fashion. Like, he wanted there to be shenanigans and hijinks every day. He with Mike Carlin and a couple other, and Elliot Brown and a couple other of the sort of cut ups in the office. They started a TV show called Cheap Laughs. We had a
Okay.
Marvel TV show, which if you Google Marvel TV Cheap Laughs, spelled Laffs,
Right.
you can see some of these early Marvel shenanigans. And so things like the Marvel Fumetti book, when we did all the little stories, and that was like Mike Carlin, he wrote most of it. And so these guys were a total pleasure to be working with. And because they wanted the office of Marvel Comics itself to be fun and creative and not corporate. And that is just that doesn't exist anymore at Marvel Comics. I don't think they encourage them to come into the office wrapped naked but wrapped in saran wrap, you know,
Do you
which is
think
what Mark did.
do you think
But
that was the reason Jim was let go from Marvel? Because Jim Shooter, to his credit, had a very sound editorial policy, had a very sound content strategy. He made sure that
I'm
the titles did not get delayed. So, I mean, it
yeah,
puzzles me to this day, why was he let go by Marvel despite performing? I mean, in my opinion, a lot of people might disagree with me, but if we have a ranking for the greatest editor in chiefs in Marvel's history, I would put Stan Lee number one, and second after him, with no disrespect to Roy Thomas, I would put Jim Shooter.
I mean, I think that you have to look at the whole concept. Jim loved the shenanigans in the office. No, Jim was always happy that there were lots of, no, that's not Jim at all.
No,
Jim,
no, I mean, what I mean is, like, why did Marvel as a group decide to let go of Jim? Because you're right,
I think
Jim
that,
was always part and parcel of the shenanigans. I remember how he let Marvel staff make fun of his height all the time.
yes. So to answer that question, people have their time as a general, as somebody. I went on to be the editor in chief of magazines myself, and you have to know when your time is ended. And it's often like a confluence of a lot of things. It's just you need to step aside for other kinds of leadership,
Right,
so I think that it I think that it's you have to know when to let go.
right,
And Jim was a great editor in chief. He helped everybody. He was obsessed with story. He very much wanted stories to each issue of a comic to have a beginning, middle, and end, even if it was part of a series of three, four, five comics. But everybody, even Stan Lee. I mean, in retrospect, did Stan Lee give artists the credit they were due? Some people, some scholars say he should have given more credit, writing credit, to Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and the people that were telling the story. So it it was a new medium. I mean, it was a brand new medium when the 60s. I mean, it goes back. I mean, I'm not a historian. You'd have to ask one of the historians. It actually goes, telling stories with pictures goes back to the hieroglyphs of Egypt and and it's and hobos writing on walls to let people know how to go across the country safely and so um, I think it's a matter of being an editor in chief, you lead with your vision, and at some point, you need another vision, and you need to step aside and let someone else come in and lead. And as an editor in chief who was in charge of stuff, whole magazines myself, I too had to know. Even I quit Marvel after 10 years because I knew I wanted to be a journalist. I was still a frustrated journalist. And so you have to step aside when you realize that there are many forces that make you want to go. But to get back to whatever we were to so Mark Grunwald gave me the assignment, but the assignment was to kill Spider-Woman. That was
Oh,
the assignment. So um, I think Chris Claremont and Steve Leialoha were doing this great job on Spider-Woman. It was a beautiful book, but the sales were dropping. Now, when sales are dropping, you have to cancel a book. And in the case, the bad thing that happens is when they cancel a book abruptly because the sales are dropping without giving the talent, the artist and writer, time to figure out what the ending's going to be. In the
right.
case of Spider-Woman, they knew they were killing the book. So Mark Grunwald had this idea to kill her.
Mhm.
And I was very new. I was only like right out of college. I was like 20 years old, 21 years old. I wasn't somebody who read
Right.
superhero comics. And so a lot of my early assignments came out of naivete. Like years later, so many people have told me that they were asked to take over Daredevil, you know, after Frank, and they said no. Who would want to follow that act? But I was too young. I went, yeah, sure, he's cool. He's, I'm raised Catholic. He's a lapsed Catholic. I thought, yeah, great. He was a street hero in Hell's Kitchen. I would walk around Hell's Kitchen. I lived there in Manhattan. It seemed a natural, and I didn't think about. So the same thing with Spider-Woman. It wasn't like I thought anything of killing Spider-Woman. I thought, oh, that's what they do. Characters live and die. And so we had this 5 or 6 issue run, I forget how many it was, to kill her off. And Mark Grunwald also had all these villains he wanted to try out in the book. I
Right.
didn't create Daddy Longlegs or Gypsy Moth or any of those. It was all Mark because he was mentoring me. He
Right.
was teaching me how to write comics. I didn't want to create a villain yet. He
Right.
was saying, here, try this one, try this one. And the whole thing led up to her death, but we decided to have her go to the astral plane so that it wouldn't be sad. So it wasn't, at no point did we think death like Elektra's death,
Right.
even though this was before Elektra's death, probably. Probably Gwen Stacy had been killed before, but
Yes.
and maybe I can't even remember if Phoenix had been killed. Phoenix was killed because, it was untenable at the time that she killed a whole planet of people, you
Right.
know?
Right.
Even though they were turned into broccoli people or something, they were like at the last minute. But so what happened was at the death of Spider-Woman in that last issue, we did a photo cover and we wanted to do everything we could to make it seem like she was actually still alive, probably. Mark, it was all Mark's idea. Um, and so there was a girl in the office that kind of looked like she could be Spider-Woman. So they did a photo shoot with her. And then me, Mark, Mike Carlin, Jack Morelli, everybody that worked on the book and others, we all got out on a fire escape
Right.
I was Tigra. I'm
Yes.
dressed as Tigra. Everybody else is dressed as whatever. And what happened was when I got the first letters, again, pre-internet,
Right.
nobody could scream at you online and troll you online, thank God. I just got letters, and the letters were people were young fans that were really upset. And it actually, that they loved Jessica Drew was her name, right? They loved Jessica Drew, and they were really sad. And I remember that's when that was a good lesson for me, because I realized that there were a lot of people who cared deeply about Spider-Woman, and it was not a nice thing to kill her. So years later, they brought her back, and I think they brought me in as a consultant to
It's
resurrect her.
Roger Stern was writing the Avengers and you were the consultant.
Yes, yeah.
So,
So
okay. Please
each thing
continue.
is a little lesson that you learn. You learn these little lessons as you start, writing comics. And
Okay. So now take us through this very important phase. Why? Because you are seeing Marvel transition from the shooter era, and I think Jim was succeeded by Tom DeFalco, if I'm not mistaken, as the editor in chief.
yeah, I left after Jim left to go be a journalist. Yeah.
Ah, okay. So you didn't start out, you didn't continue with Marvel. You came back to Marvel again to write Daredevil in 80.
I can't remember. You'd have to look at Wikipedia, but I I think that I when I left Marvel, I was stayed the writer of Daredevil. So I became a freelancer, and I had a freelancer contract with Marvel, which was great because back then Marvel was really generous.
Okay.
They had like the whole time I was at Marvel, you had a deal where they took $10 out of your paycheck every week, and then they doubled it. I mean, it was amazing that when you left Marvel, you had what the equivalent today would be of a little tiny pension. You had a
Right.
little bit of money that you could use to move on to something else. And it was so there was that, and then I had a contract so that I could stay on the healthcare. And I had a contract to write so many contract comics a month. So I kept up with Daredevil while I went to get my master's at Columbia in journalism and political affairs, SIPA, School of International Affairs,
Right.
um, and started becoming a real journalist. Um, so I continued to write, and then also miniseries, because I was always doing journalism, and miniseries came along while I was still at staff, when I was what they called the mutant editor. Like each office had their thing. Jim Salicrup and Danny Fingeroth were in charge of
Right.
Spider-Man. Mark Grunwald and Mike and whoever his assistants were over the years were in charge of the Avengers.
Captain
And
America.
I was the mutant editor. And so we started, and the mutant office, I mean, I always say all I did was watch Louise Simonson and how she worked with Chris, because I was her assistant first.
Right.
And I just would sit there quietly and watch how she got Chris to, like, she would just start talking about a character like Ileana. We haven't done anything with her. What about this? What about, and Chris would just jam away, and they would jam away, and the next thing you know, they had like the storylines for all of his books laid out. And so when I took over as the mutant editor, I had
Right.
learned from Wheezy that Chris is insanely creative. He's got a billion stories, and all you have to do is get them talking, take notes, go this way, don't go that way. I mean, um, so
Sorry, if I can interject here before you move forward. You while you are the mutant editor, you also were one of the writers for X-Men Heroes for Hope. which
Yeah.
had stories by Chris Claremont, by Stan Lee, by Bill Mantlo, by Jim Shooter himself. Uh, I mean, because I really want to understand and experience the world through you, because you are not only writing this title, one of the story writers for this title. You created Long Shot, you created Mojo, you created Spiral. And the reason I'm saying that, why did they have so much influence on us, was that in 1993, there was an X-Men game that was released on Sega Genesis. And we got to see the Mojo world in that game. We had to fight Mojo in that game, aside from reading comics and everything. And it has left a lasting impact. And right now you are like in that era where New Mutants are pre-X-Force. Chris Claremont is writing it. There's a Wolverine ongoing series also, and everything. This is I mean, I would like you to share something about this time,
Well, I
about
think
the
I think
Mutant
what
Editor
happened,
and the writer.
I think it came out of me wanting to be a journalist. And really early on I was writing little stories that would get published in alternate newspapers and stuff, really little things. But I had friends who were journalists, and they always used to talk about how media kept buying up other media and how a conglomerate, and they would talk about Noam Chomsky, and he
Yes.
wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent, where he warned us very early on is that if only a few people own the media, you're not going to get free press. And that's what's happening now in the United States as media has gone over to social media, and social media is owned and controlled by a few billionaire CEOs who don't care about the truth. So, and don't care about anything really, from what I can tell. So, but way back then, you had people like Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky and Walter Lippmann, even before that, and Marshall McLuhan. You had media experts that were telling us, watch out, watch out, watch out. Like, really be scared when a corporation owns the media. And so that's where Mojo came from. Mojo came from, like, what if there was one villain that controlled all the media, including back then you have to remember, it was the media was TV, and people used to say, oh, I'm watching too much TV,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
TV is bad, get out of. And our parents raised us that way. You can
Yes.
have 1 hour of TV, and after that, get out of the house, go live in the real world. And that was sort of the beginning of the end. Television, it was sort of like, at least back then, your parents could shut it off, and there were only 11 channels, and the TV went dark at midnight or whenever it used to go dark. And you had to live real life. You had to read a book at night instead of streaming a TV show. And so I don't mean to sound all good old days, because what happened happened, and now we have to deal with it. But so Mojo to me became someone who was going to suck your soul out and did not care that
Right.
you were ruining your own life by becoming addicted to the Mojoverse. So and back then we used to call people who watch too much TV, we used to call them, like, I don't know, boob tubers or vidiots. There were all these names for people who watched too much TV, because it was considered like a bad alternative to actually going out and living life. So Mojo came out of that and back then, I mean, you're talking 40 years ago or however long it's been.
Right.
It's like, I had no idea at the time that 40 years later it was going to be such a huge problem to have, even though people like Noam Chomsky and all Ed Herman and all these guys were ringing a bell. Watch out! Watch out! Watch out! So, and you have the same thing. Basically, you had the seeds is, goes back to Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring, which was a book where a female writer wrote a book about how we were ruining the environment and the earth needed, we were killing the earth. Back then it was acid rain. I don't
Yeah,
know if you remember acid rain, and we were all like, acid rain? You mean the rain has acid in it?
right,
But it was literally like, again, that was 50 years ago, where people were like, the earth is fine now. If you kill it, there's nowhere left for you to live. So it was just an interesting time, and Mojo hit a chord, I think, in people, and has gone on to hit. And it's funny because I did a long shot story, and the editor, Mark Basso, wonderful Marvel editor, Mark Basso and Drew, they sent me some issues of what the current young writers were doing with Mojo, and they were giving Mojo like, emojis and streaming, and it was all about, they had just updated the media for him. And
right.
I was, this is brilliant. It's wonderful that the new young writers got it and were like, yeah, Mojo. And so I think that answered the question, right? That
Yes, it does pretty extensively because for not a lot has been said about Mojo, Longshot, that era of the New Mutants, and obviously, I mean, like for most of the people I come across over here in Saudi Arabia, for example, or even in general internet discourse, when I mention the word Ann Nocenti, Nocenti, the first word everyone, the first name that comes to mind in the minds of everyone is Daredevil.
yeah.
So it's for me, it was quite important because you have been a part and parcel of a very important part in Marvel history. I mean, when you joined Marvel, you had Mary Jo Duffy as one of the writers. You being a young aspiring talent, you also ended up from being a secretary to becoming a writer. And at the same time, Louise Simonson, I'm so glad, I'm really grateful to you that you mentioned Louise in this one because her work for X books, particularly for X Factor, remains one of the best ever I have ever read.
Well, also the Wheezy, we call her Wheezy, Power Pack,
Power
because
Pack, yes, I forgot about
Power
Power Pack.
Pack is really important. And to mention, so Marie Severin was on staff. So we had a really powerful, talented female right there on staff, Marie Severin, who, because she came in the business, 20 years before us,
Right,
she really should have been elevated in the company, but she wasn't, because the sexism was even stronger for the generation before mine. But she was, I ended up like, one of the highlights of my career is getting to write a comic with Marie Severin and Marie Drew, which was a issue of Toxic Avenger,
right.
where Marie and I decided to give Toxic Avenger's girlfriend a front and center role, and to make it a feminist comic where her girlfriend, Toxie's girlfriend, I forget her name, she was just like, why am I not the hero? And she goes into the kitchen and she gets a bunch of like, cola pots and pans, and makes her outfit and goes out there. And that was like so much fun. But you had Trina Robbins from the
Yes,
from independent comics. You had lots of female independent comic artists, Eileen Crumb, and I mean, I'm blanking probably on a lot of the great ones, but and we had artists too. We had Mary Wilshire. We had on, she did Firestar. We had June Brigman, who did Power Pack. So Joe Duffy, me, Marie Javins, who's now like the editor in chief of DC. She started under Archie Goodwin in at Epic, and she was my editor for a Typhoid Mary series with John Van Fleet, where she let us go insane. You know,
okay. Then,
God bless, God bless Marie Javins for letting me do that.
okay, now I want to basically like talk about Daredevil, because Daredevil, besides being a favorite character, the character has become, if not uh, as popular as Batman in this part of the world, but he's a close runner up because of the series. And when we are talking about the series, because it's not just the Daredevil series that came about, like you mentioned, we had Luke Cage, we had Jessica Jones, and most importantly, in your case, we had Iron Fist. Why am I saying Iron Fist? Is because Iron Fist season 2 gave us your character, Typhoid Mary.
I think what happened there, I don't really know what happened, but I do know that um, when Netflix had a deal with Marvel to produce shows, and they had a showrunner who was exceptional talent, Loeb, Joe,
Jeff Loeb,
Jeff
Jeff
Loeb.
Loeb, and Kareem Zarek.
Yes, absolutely exceptional talent, people who came out of comics, who understood comics and television. And, the rumor was that Typhoid was going to just start in Iron Fist and then go into the different TV shows and end up in Daredevil. And when something happens on a corporate level and there was a change, I think Marvel and the Netflix deal fell apart or something. I can't remember. But all that whole slate of ongoing stories had to be killed, and then time went by and then they restarted. But I know that Typhoid was originally introduced in Iron Fist, but she was supposed to then come into the Daredevil TV show. So that would have been great, of course, but it didn't happen, you know. But and it's really fun to see how each character, how they're interpreted from the comics to the screen, and that's a lot of fun for us as creators. And I watched, Blackheart was introduced into a movie, and Typhoid had been introduced in a Daredevil movie. But you just because the whole way that TV shows and films are structured, it's very different. There are a lot more moving parts and a lot more money involved. You just never know. You have way less understanding or control about what's. And I spent 10 years in the film business and had a film made and made movies, and so I did learn that it's much more story by committee, and story by committee is very different from story by a single individual. But I think that also we have to get back to the character Daredevil himself. Why is he such a great character? And for me, it's because he has so many conflicts within him.
Right.
He's the lapsed Catholic that wears the devil suit, that makes no sense that he's a lapsed Catholic that wears a devil suit, other than that even though he's not a Christian anymore, or he wasn't when I was writing, and maybe he is now. Um, in fact, I think somebody did do a storyline where they brought him back to being someone who believed in God. Um, he he knows that the devil is a potent symbol, that he can use that on the street, because they call it, who is it? Pascal's wager, kind of like you might as well believe in God, because it's sort of like you
Yeah.
might as well believe, so he's got that, but he's also got, and the thing that he's a lawyer. He believes in the justice system, but if he can't get justice, and it's a beautiful segue um, into street justice, into vigilantism.
But
That
he
if the
doesn't
court,
but he doesn't crosses the line like the Punisher.
no, and I did a Punisher Daredevil story just to be able to talk about that.
I'm
That he
gonna
does.
come to that. I'm gonna come to that.
Yes, so it's sort of like, so my brother was a lawyer, is a lawyer, and so I knew, I even put my brother into Daredevil. I had my brother running the legal aid clinic when Daredevil lost his. I took his license away from him and had him
Yes,
read. My brother is the one that was trying all those cases in court during my run. My
right.
brother David, and so, s- so as a lawyer, he has the checks and balances, he has this inner sort of like superpower of knowing what is right and what is wrong. That is a superpower, but he's also blind, and as we know, the symbol of blind justice,
Right.
the lady with the, band over her eyes. And so you have I mean, right just then, the justice vigilante, the blind justice, the blindness, the lapsed Catholic, the Christian, he has so many contradictory things going on inside him that he walks into a room and there's already a tension. And then you add on to that, and this is something that when you take over a book and you read who the stories that went before you, I went back and read. Back then, there was Stanley, there were Roger McKenzie, Frank Miller. There hadn't been that many writers yet. And Frank established basically one of the things that Frank added to the Daredevil narrative was his strange taste in women. He had this kind of like rescue fantasies with Karen. Karen was always like,
Damsel in distress.
she was always yeah, damsel in distress, but also this intrigue with women that were empowered to the point of he fell in love with an assassin,
Like,
Electra. So he had set up this bad girl, good girl thing, and I don't even think that we even talked about that. I think it was just me and Johnny wanted to create a villain for Daredevil, and I think Johnny tells this story, and I remember it from back in the day. The girl he was dating was getting all dolled up to go out. Back in the 80s, people went to clubs, and
yeah,
dance. And
yeah.
she was getting all dolled up to go out. And she came out wearing Typhoid's outfit with the fishnets and the short, whatever. And the padded shoulders. And so Johnny and I would sit around and talk about how there were not the women in comics were like the wife, the secretary, the girlfriend, and we wanted to create a female character that could be all the stereotypes all rolled in one person. And that dovetailed well into what Frank had set up because then we could do this multiple personality character that where and because Matt had two personas, that innocent Mary, religious, wanting, I think she was teaching the blind at the time, was a perfect damsel in distress to that Typhoid sent after Matt while she herself went after Daredevil. So it was like this sort of perfect storm moment in comics for us to be able to do that, to build on what went before and create something new.
Okay. When I crudely compare the works, not in the sense of who did better, but basically like what's the key difference, what defines Frank Miller's work for Daredevil and what defines Ann Nocenti's work for Daredevil. What I find is that Frank basically focused more on the internal conflict of Matt Murdock as a Catholic who is struggling with his disability and at the same time his vigilanteism while also ensuring that he doesn't cross the line like Frank Castle. Whereas when I read Anne Nocenti's work, I see less of the religious what should I say theme, and I see more of social justice theme into Daredevil. but a lot of horror. Why? Because if we
A
are
lot of
reading
what?
horror,
Horror. I guess, you are an authors are, we're individuals, we're different people. So I had different obsessions than Frank did. And I was definitely, and for one thing, I think that because my brother was a lawyer and I was interested in the legal system,
right,
I just sort of naturally put Matt in the courtroom more often. And even when taking his license away and having him run a legal aid clinic, because the social justice thing for me was if you can't afford a lawyer, where do you go?
right,
So that came right out of the street, and it came out of my life being more and probably, I mean, courtroom dramas are notoriously boring, and especially boring in an action adventure comic. So who knows what he was thinking? Maybe he was thinking avoid the lawyer courtroom side and bring in ninjas and action and like Japanese film being influenced by Kurosawa and Zatoichi and all that. And also, he had done all the religious stuff. You don't want to follow, even though I also am a lapsed Catholic, you don't want to follow religion with religion. So you take a different, I have no idea if Frank had done courtroom dramas, would I have written religious, taken on the religious thing? You just want to do something different.
yeah,
And
but
uh,
there's one other feature. Apologies for interjecting, right this one, because I find it really astonishing that you are doing the courtroom drama and the social justice bit. But at the same time, if somebody comes to me and asks me, I mean, like, I want to read those really nasty supernatural with a touch of horror stories for Daredevil, who should I read? And I will say Ann Nocenti. Why? Because you came up with the idea that Mephisto has a son. You
yeah.
got Daredevil deeply involved with the devil himself.
Well, I think that part of that, and I just looked at the time, I have only another 5 minutes because,
Oh, okay.
yeah. So the and I think it goes back to Dick Tracy.
Right.
Like when I was a kid, having only the Pogo and the Dick Tracy volumes, and Dick Tracy comics, there were all these like, Dick Tracy had the gadgets, he had the watch, he had the Jetson stuff. But really, what was great about that early volume of stories were the villains. He had Mumbles and Flat Top and Pear Shaped Man, and he had all these like villains that were. And I think that when I first started writing Daredevil, I was less interested in the hero than I was in the villain. And my run started with weird villain after weird villain. I mean, it was like just a series of weird villains. And I remember at some point, Ralph, my editor, my very wise and brilliant editor, Ralph Macchio, he was like, all these villains, they're really fun and they're really cool, but I think you need to pay attention with the guy whose name is the book is Daredevil. And that's when me and John Romita Jr. and Ralph, we all started talking about designing a villain specifically for Daredevil. Um, and that's where Typhoid Mary, Bullet, Bushwhacker. We started designing villains to be perfect foils for Daredevil.
Right.
And I had to let all my Dick Tracy stuff go, of just yet another weird villain. Remember there was one called Rotgut, and that was like a horrific character in a horrific comic. And you know,
But I really liked Coppersmith because Coppersmith, when we were watching the Netflix series and we find Daredevil arguing with the Punisher about his brand of justice, it had the shade of your story and it had the shade
yeah.
of Frank Miller. The influence that you have had on the kids who are growing up in the 90s in Saudi Arabia, as I've shown you this comic book of mine, because unfortunately I had more, but this is the only one that has survived till now. It even has the local Saudi distributor's price tag on it. So, how do you feel when, like, for example, you came across this information that you were like like the most favorite for the fandom over here in the
Oh,
90s and stuff?
I did not know that. I did not know that. There was so that's Walt Simonson calls the 80s the second golden age of comics. And I think that if you like my work, look at the other creators from the 80s. You had Bill Sienkiewicz, not just that his Moon Knight and then the work we did together with Chris on the New Mutants, but
Right.
then his Stray Toasters, and then him teaming up with Frank to do an Elektra series and you had to bring up Karen Berger. Really, Karen Berger changed the industry in the 80s. That's why it's such an honor to be working with her now with
Right.
these two graphic novels. The Seeds and Ruby Falls are still my sensibility in a modern age. But if you look at the old Vertigo lineup, you have Swamp Thing and Alan Moore, and you had Jade the Changing Man and Doom Patrol, and it was hit after hit after hit that came out of the 80s comics. So you can really see, and beyond that, the independent comics, whether you talking, one of my personal favorites is Gary Panter or Art Spiegelman or Love and Rockets, the Hernandez brothers. The 80s was like, just everything that came out of the 80s was good. The 90s, not so much, but the 80s were
Agreed,
great.
agreed, agreed. Okay, without taking much of your time, just one more thing, because you have been involved with this very groundbreaking documentary, Disarming Falcons. You even went to a very tribal region of Balochistan and you had interactions with the Balochi resistance and so forth. What can people expect? Because Saudi Arabia has changed significantly. There are a lot of workshops going on and everything. You are also teaching filmmaking. Can we expect Ann Nocenti to be here in Saudi Arabia to teach filmmaking to aspirants here in Saudi Arabia?
Well, if they invite me, I will come. But the other thing is that what I would say, because the only reason I got to go to Baluchistan and make the film and go on the falcon hunt was because a door opened, and it was a friend of mine, Wendy Johnson, who
Right.
opened the door and said, "Do you want to come?" So I would say that the lesson from this for you is, if a door opens, walk through the door. Don't think, I mean, I literally ran, got a camera, got on a plane with the manual, read the manual, was reading the great Selig Harrison, reading his work about Baluchistan on the plane on the way there. You don't, if you're not an expert and you don't know what you're doing, just do it. Just get on the plane, go do it. So I would say that the best thing I can say is that if a door opens, walk through it. And which was the same thing that happened to me in Haiti, is that my friend David Bell started a film school in Haiti, and he invited me. I had never taught film before, and he invited me down there to teach film. And I ended up making, as a producer, because the spirit down there was, don't have the person from the United States making the film about Haiti. Put the cameras in the hands of the Haitians, stand back. So that became my style of teaching film, was to put cameras in the hands of people who didn't think they were empowered enough to make their own movie. And now that the technology has become so much better than back when I was making movies, it was still tape, you know.
Right. Yes.
Um, so yeah, so I do this thing called boot camp filmmaking, which is where I just get you talking about what you care about and help you shape a story. And then we go out, and we also do what we established in Haiti was zero budget filmmaking,
Right.
meaning You don't need money. You have your story. And if you need a car and you don't have a car, use a bicycle. Rewrite
Right.
the script for a bicycle. And if you can't find a bicycle, walk. In Haiti, of course, these things are hard. It's hard to even find a bicycle. It's a very poor country.
True.
So, zero budget filmmaking, helping you pull a story out of you. So that's kind of the method we use. And also, we would shoot fiction inside documentary,
Right.
which is that you just use found sets, found locations, use your friends, just get out there and make a movie. There's a lot of examples now of hybrid films where fictions were shot inside documentaries. But if you go back to like World War II and Rossellini, like the Italian directors who basically just didn't have the budget to do studio movies, and you just go out and you use what's there and you shape the story by what is free, so you don't have to worry about raising money. You will need money. You will need to feed everyone.
Right. Okay, last question, and then the interview comes to a conclusion. Uh, you mentioned that you met Charlie Cox and Vincent D'Onofrio,
Yeah.
and they mentioned your work. Which of the two is your most favorite?
I mean,
Who
I
has
don't know.
done who has done justice with the character?
I mean, I don't know them, either of them, well enough to have a favorite, but I think that
On
because
screen. On screen.
um, so this is the thing, is that Charlie Cox as Daredevil, to a certain degree, heroes have to be completely relatable. They have to be kind of like an everyman.
Right.
It's like the protagonist has to be someone that you want to follow and that is very relatable. And I think that he does a brilliant job at bringing the humanity and warmth and flexibility, because Daredevil is flexibility, whereas Vince D'Onofrio was given, the kingpin. So there's a gravitas that he brings to the. It's almost. I just was writing a Thanos story. I was writing not Thanos, a Galactus story.
Yes.
I wrote a Galactus story where Rogue becomes Galactus's herald, and she just is like, she's got that southern sass and she's right up in his face.
Right.
And but when I was writing in the plot and I wrote to the artist, I wrote, shoot Galactus, like, when you're drawing, put the camera at his feet and shoot up and have everything kind of bend around him, because you want even the just physical presence of him to seem to bend the world around him. So Vince D'Onofrio, he walks into a scene and the whole world bends around him because he has the gravitas of like a character like Galactus. Whereas Matt Murdock slash Daredevil he's flexible. He's listening. He's thinking about what is the right thing, not his own ego. And so they're very different characters. And I think they both did brilliant jobs, you know?
With that, our interview comes to an end. Once again, a special shout out to Roy Schwartz, author of Is Superman Circumcised? Thank you, Ann Nocenti, for
Yes.
taking out the time.
And inshallah, let us hope that there's more peace in the world between cultures.
It will be. It will be, because as long as there are people who are doing Cosmic Con, as long as there are people like yourself, as long as there are people like Roy, because I really am grateful to him that in his narrative, in his writings, he did not do that Judeo-Christian thing. He said Judeo-Christian Islam as one family, which that is the reality. So as long as we have people like you, we have hope. There will be peace, patience, and perseverance, just like Matt Murdock is
Yeah.
necessary.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you
Son
so much.
Jeremy.
Thank you. Stay blessed.
Bye.